Hello and welcome to the Owlkids Books Picture Book Palooza panel called Fresh Faces, a chat with debut creators. I'm Judy Brunsek, Director of Sales and Marketing for Owlkids Books, and I'm really happy to host this panel. Before I introduce the panelists, I'd like to acknowledge that our office in Toronto is located on the traditional territory of many nations, including the Wendat, the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee, and the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. We acknowledge that the land Toronto sits on is covered by Treaty 15, known as the Toronto Purchase, signed with the Mississaugas of the Credit, and the Williams Treaties, signed with multiple Mississauga and Chippewa bands. As publishers of children's books and magazines, we take seriously our responsibility to educate our audiences about the history and legacy of colonialization and its impact on Indigenous peoples. And we are dedicated to working toward an equitable future. Let me introduce our panelists and their books. Sophie Kohn writes and teaches about humor and satire at Second City, Toronto and LA. She's been a writer for radio and magazines, with work appearing on the CBC, NPR, and in the New Yorker, McSweeney's, and Hazlitt. She lives in Nelson, BC, with her family. KATRINA, HYENA, stand-up comedian, is Sophie's first book and is illustrated by Aparna Varma. It's an early chapter book about a laughing hyena yearning to be a stand-up comic who manages to overcome the obvious obstacles about hyenas and laughter. With a bit of luck and some handy shadow play, KATRINA is able to convince Gary the lion, the hyena clan's natural predator, to pick up as many hot sauces, because of course hyenas taste better that way, and skedaddle, leaving the clan able to laugh and applaud at KATRINA's act regularly. Danesh Mohiuddin is a comic artist, political cartoonist, and freelance illustrator who's done ad campaigns and designed toys and games. He's also illustrated two of the books in the Princess Prue and Augie series for Owlkids Books. Princess Prue and the Ogre on the Hill was nominated for an OLA Blue Spruce Award. Mummy and Me, A Monstrous Tale, is the first picture book that is both written and illustrated by Danesh. It's sweet and loving, if topsy-turvy, ode to the love between moms and their toddlers. The book opens with Wee Wolf waking up in the evening, ready for a night of adventure with his mummy, who is, well, a mummy. While Wee Wolf has his mummy tend to his needs throughout the night, brushing his unruly fur, feeding him, and reading favorite stories from fairy tales, he also tries to help her, which makes the time together just a little more exhausting for her. But they both know that that it's love that binds them. Welcome to our two debut creators, Sophie and Danesh. Hello. Hello.
Hi.
Welcome. Hi. So glad to be talking to you about your books. So and congratulations on your debuts. So, but before we go into too much detail, what I want to do is gush with you a little bit, because it's always so exciting to be in this kind of a situation. You know, it's a first book. It's pretty exciting. So Sophie, I wanted to, just before I asked you about this, I wanted to mention that Kirkus reviewed KATRINA HYENA and said, whether stage struck or shy, readers will chuckle at the protagonist's jokes and cheer for her determination and confidence. How does it feel to have your first book children's book published?
It's the best. Yeah, I feel like it's been such an amazing process to watch it come to life, from just, you know, a handful of pages in a Google document to the art coming in and all these, you know, decisions we had to make and things we had to tweak. And it's very surreal. I feel like until I have it in my hands, I can't really actually believe it's happened.
That's great. And Danesh, so with Mummy and Me, we had a PW review that said the message of the parent-child unconditional love shines through the chaos, especially during the duo's stress-relieving dance sequence, which moves from pouty to party. So you've illustrated picture books before, but this is your first work as both author and illustrator. How does that feel?
Yeah, I mean, it's amazing. Like, it's amazing to have an idea, which pretty much what I see as writing is like an idea extended into a narrative, and then to be able to draw it. So no, it's really amazing, and it's just pretty surreal. And like Sophie said, I'm excited to actually hold the book, to believe that it's actually been published and it's happened.
Yeah. I guess the baby doesn't feel real until you have it in your hands. Is that what you mean?
Yeah, it's kind of like that. That's a good analogy.
Let's stick with you, Danesh, for a moment. Since you're both an author and illustrator, in this book, what came first, the text or the illustrations? You know, did you,
Um,
what inspired you
yeah.
to do the writing and the illustrating at the same time?
So specifically this book, it was I think it was 2018, and it was right like a month before Halloween. And there's an artist challenge that happens on like social media called Inktober. I don't know if you've heard of it, but it's a challenge where to inspire each other, we just say, okay, every day for a month you have to do a drawing. And I decided like for that idea, because I had a son, and I have a son, and my son was I think around 2 at the time. And so I wanted to do something about that, about parenting, and it was close to Halloween, and I wanted to do something every day. So I had this idea would be like, oh, it's like a little wolf being raised by a mummy. And I did a mummy because I just thought it was a funny play on words. And I went to the Halloween store and I bought a wolf costume with like the mask and because I wanted the hand, because I wanted the hand. So originally when I did this just for fun, I pretended like it was a uh, wolf's journal, like writing out his memories. So I would post like a wolf's hand on social media with a brush in the hand and drawing this thing, and that's what I did every day for a month. And then it was just kind of sad in the draws for a while. And then, after I did Princess Prue, and I was in, in good communication with all of you, I said, oh, I just kind of threw this out there, and like and it's credible for me for it to being published. So in terms of your question of words or pictures, it's really for me, it's they're both tell a story, so they kind of happen together. I can't say me maybe pictures first a little bit and then words, but I think they kind of evolve at the same time.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, because there's such a process to putting together, as you alluded to, Sophie, there's such a process to putting a book together for kids. Between the words and the illustrations, it's a complicated situation. And so sometimes it's like, what is the chicken, what's the egg, I guess. Sophie, you wrote your book at a very specific time of your life, and you have that provided you with insights and included a top-notch joke from a particular place. Can you tell us about the process of writing the book and some of that and some of where that joke came from?
Yeah, so I wrote this book on mat leave. I had my son in 2020. I actually found out I was pregnant the day the world went into lockdown for COVID. Yeah. So
Wow.
it was a lot. It was a lot. And yeah, so he was born in 2020, and we were very hunkered down. We were very sort of in isolation, obviously, with a newborn and with COVID going on. And this is pre-vaccination and all that. Um and in the first, I guess, year of his life, I read him probably like 5 trillion children's books. um and I spent a lot of time in bed just sort of, snuggled up with him, reading to him. And I became really interested in how there were some books that were just flat out amazing. And I was like, man, that would be so cool to be able to do that. But then there were some books where the text or the premise was really amazing, but the art sort of fell flat, and it didn't really. And I sort of thought with different art, the story could be so incredible. And then vice versa, there were books that I read where um, the art was incredible and the art was just mind blowing. And the art made the entire book, and the story was almost kind of irrelevant. Um, and so I became really interested in how those two things sort of interplayed with each other. And as a person who writes, up until that point, had only ever written for adults, art and illustration had never been part of my work and had never been part of my consideration. I had never conceived of a story visually before. And so just by immersing myself in the world of 10 million children's books, I was home with a lot of time on my hands, and I was feeling a bit disconnected from my career because I was on a mat leave that got extended about 3 times because of COVID. And I was like, I don't know if I'm ever going to write anything ever again. But that felt like something I could sort of start playing around with and tinkering around with. I was like, maybe I could write a kid's book. Maybe I could it felt sort of less intimidating than writing like, a novel or something like that. And I was like, maybe I could just write something kind of short, and I could write 1 page today, I could write 1 page tomorrow, and I started doing that, and pretty soon I had a story. And as for the joke, that came a bit later when he was about 2, and we were then in the process of editing, and the art was coming in. We were sort of I was working with an editor on some revisions at that time. And one of the characters in the book is a dung beetle. And my editor, one of the challenges with this book was the editor was like, you have to come up with like a stand-up comedy set that would be delivered by a hyena. And it was truly one of the like hardest writing challenges I've ever had. And I was like, man, I really, and I sort of envisioned all the other creatures in her audience, and I was like, stand-up comedy, they usually heckle people, or not heckle, they usually roast people in the audience. They make fun of you. If you sit in the front row, they pick on you. And there was a dung beetle in the audience, and my editor had said, can you come up with a joke sort of at the expense of a dung beetle, or something that she might say in her stand-up set about a dung beetle? And I was like, I really can't. It is such a hilariously specific thing. And I thought about it for a few days. And then my son, who was learning the alphabet around that time and was walking around the house naked, loudly singing it at all times, and was also in the process of potty learning. So these two things kind of like fused in his mind. And just spontaneously one day, he was sitting on the potty and singing the alphabet, and he sang Elemento Poo instead of Elemento P. And he laughed maniacally at his own joke for seriously like 20 minutes. Like, he thought it was the best thing. And then I was like, that actually, for this age group of reader, that actually could work for the dung beetle joke. And I emailed my editor, and I was like, all right, this is a bit of a long shot, but my son just said this. Could this work? And she was like, I love it. It's perfect. And so he has a published joke in a book at the age of 2. I'm frankly a little jealous of him.
There you go.
So yeah, that's how that came about.
That's great. I love it. So in both cases, your kids have provided you with inspiration and information, I suppose, in terms of that. I'm going to stick with you for a little bit, Sophie. Many folks don't know that authors of books don't select their illustrators. So how did seeing Aparna's interpretations of your text make you feel? Did they add something unexpected to how you might have envisioned the story?
Oh yeah, they added, I would say, a few really key things. I think the first thing is that her art, I think her art made the book feel real in a way that it hadn't before. Like, I think, like I said before, it was sort of just a handful of pages. And when the art came in and we started fusing the words and the pictures, it sort of gave the book like a new gravitas. And I was kind of like, oh, this is really happening. But the other thing that was so delightful about the art, and her art in particular, was I guess it was something I hadn't really appreciated about art before, because I'm a terrible artist and I can't draw to save my life. And I'm just blown away by people who can. But that she was able to express so much humor, and actually quite a few jokes, through art. And that was such a beautiful compliment to the text, obviously, because it's about humor and it's about comedy. But I was so blown away by the way the art had such a personality, and it had such there was so much humor just contained within the art. And the art, I think, really elevated the humor in the text, and they sort of like played off each other. And I had no hand in choosing the illustrator, but I really could not have asked for a better one. Like, I feel like she was so perfectly suited to this particular project. And yeah, just the magic and the humor that her art brought to the story was so lovely, and so validating, I think, as an author.
Yeah.
Because I'd sort of envisioned these characters. I hadn't really envisioned them visually. I guess I had sort of envisioned them. Like, I'd given some thought to their backstory and all these more literary things about them.
Right.
But when she, and I spent a long time choosing their names, and I was very intellectual about it all. But when she brought them to life in color and in facial features and things like that, like, that was they were suddenly so much more three-dimensional, and that was just amazing to see.
Yeah, and that humor really, really comes through. Danesh, I'm going to just pick up on this question of humor because there's so much humor in Mummy and Me. I mean, you know, from naming, you know, about from the mummy being a mummy, sure, but there's also just like lots of little bits and pieces. And so, how do you make some of those choices to bring humor into your illustrations?
You know, I grew up on like Mad Magazine,
Yes.
and in Dubai where I grew up, we didn't have access to a lot of movies, or there's a lot of censorship. So I never watched Star Wars till recently, and Star Wars I saw it all. I read all the Mad. So, you know, I've always just loved you know, just the idea that something on paper can make you laugh.
Mm.
I feel like that's such a magical kind of thing, and I just love it. I love humor, and I really just draw, I think, to make myself laugh, or to amuse myself while drawing. And that's the only thing I know. I don't really know if it's gonna be funny to anyone else. I have no idea. I just hope. But yeah, I just draw what I enjoy. So it's as simple as that, you know.
Right. So
Yeah.
follow your gut feeling. This kind of
Yeah.
goes into my next question, which is, do you either of you have any advice for aspiring authors or illustrators? The kind of thing that if you knew way back when, you know what you know now. Danesh, where you're kind of leading into that with what you were just saying, which is, you know, follow your gut. But do you have any other advice that you would prefer to
Yeah.
budding illustrators and or authors?
I would say that to just make the thing you want to make, and not wait for anything. For like the mummy, before I approached you guys with it, I had 31 drawings, because I did a drawing a day, and that's how I approached you guys with. Because and then you could see that they were finished drawings, and it was easy to approve. You see where it was going. And even though I drew the whole book again, like I didn't use any of those original drawings, and I drew 30 new drawings for the book, it was still those drawings that got me, you know, to do the book, actually do the book. So what I would say is, don't wait. Just like, if you're like I don't know, if you want to do like a Spider-Man book, and you know do it, just make the book. Just pretend like, you know, that book's there to be made, and have the thing like on paper. And I think that's the only way, really, is to do it.
Is to just to move forward with whatever the idea is in your head and just create it and then take a look
Yeah,
at it and see. Yeah,
whether someone's hired you or not, you just pretend
right,
like the person you want to hire you has hired you, and you're doing it, and just make the book. And you're not going to get paid for it, but it can get you into a paying job.
right. Okay, great. And Sophie, what about you as a writer? Because you've got a lot of writing experience.
Yeah, I mean, so much of what Danesh is saying is true of writing too. Like I think with humor writing, I certainly worry, is this going to land with people? Are people going to find this funny? And it's too overwhelming to think of the entire planet. So I generally write until I've made myself laugh. That's that's sort of my barometer. Um, because I think that way, at the very least, I'm creating an authentic piece of art. I'm creating something that's authentic to my voice that nobody else is going to create. And the people that do appreciate it will really appreciate it, as opposed to sort of watering yourself down and trying to appeal to all these disparate groups of people. But I would say the other thing I really, really learned throughout this process that I would, I guess, advise people who were wanting to write a kid's book is how crucial it is to think visually. And like I said before, that was not something that was completely foreign to me. Like I have never, I have never sort of exercised that part of my brain in my work before. And, you know, paying attention to things like, one thing that was really driven home in the editing process was the element of suspense that exists in a kid's book. Like kids love moments where, like, where is the page turning? Like, is it turning on a crucial moment where you don't know what's about to happen? And like breaking up the text to sort of support those moments of surprise. And when you create a sentence, really give some thought to like what is happening visually on the page at the same time. And this was all like completely new to me. And I feel like that was a big part of creating this book. And when I sat down at my kitchen table to just write it in a Google document way back in 2020, I was not thinking visually at all. I was just, I was tinkering with the words and the right adjectives and all this kind of thing. But if you can sort of have a more expansive view of the story and think about, yeah, like where are those little cliffhanger moments going to drop? Like, where is chapter 1 going to end? Are you going to end on a suspenseful note? Like all these kind of things. And the physical layout of the book has a lot apparently to do with that. Like by page 5, you should have this, this kind of thing set up and this suspense kind of waiting to be dropped. And like, there are all these sort of like visual and tactile elements that I think I didn't know about going in. And I'm so glad that I had that education through this process.
Yeah, I think that because your book is an early chapter book, and that's the kind of the graduation from picture books to more extended reading. It's that notion of separating the sections and all of that sort of thing. So that becomes more real as the illustrations enter into it as well. And I mean, the idea of a cliffhanger works for adults too, as we know, right? There's a lot of fiction written that way. Okay, now one final question, just for fun. What are you currently reading? Danesh.
Oh man, I'm terrible with this. I start like 10 books and I don't finish any of them. I think what is that book by I'm seeing it in my living room. Gabriel Garcia Marquez, the famous
100 Years of Solitude.
100 Years of Solitude. Yeah, so I started that, and I also am reading Frankenstein again.
Wow.
I'm reading a bunch of like history books, and I think I forgot. Yeah.
That's okay. You've given us two that you're reading, that you're dipping into. Sophie, what about you?
I'm reading an unbelievable memoir right now called Educated by Tara Westover. And it's about this woman. She's in her late 30s now, but she grew up in rural, remote Idaho in this survivalist Mormon family who didn't even give her a birth certificate. Like that's how prepper-esque they were. They didn't trust the government. They kept her out of school. They never let her visit a doctor. She, according to the state, does not exist as a person.
Right.
Because her parents didn't want the government like knowing about their family. And her parents are like hardcore fundamentalists. And like it's about growing up in that environment, but then she ends up really craving an education and really getting curious about the outside world that she's been denied for so long. And she ends up going to like Cambridge and Oxford, and like she did not attend like a single day of school, and she somehow ends up sort of like escaping from this upbringing and educating herself. And I'm only about halfway through, so I'm not sure what happens at the end, but it is like wow.
Yeah, it's completely fascinating. Yeah, it's a few years old, but it's completely fascinating.
Yeah.
Okay, well, thank you both for a lovely chat. I'm going to thank our audience for joining us today. You can read and review today's books and more on Edelweiss and NetGalley by clicking through the links in our Owlkids booth. So I'm going to say goodbye to everybody. Bye, Danesh. Bye, Sophie. And bye everybody else.
Thanks a lot.